Hello, hello.
All of that is excellent and surprisingly good. I worry, of course, about the midterm elections and whether he can succeed in showing enough progress to stave off Democratic losses in 2022, which would result in the kind of blockage that President Obama had to deal with and was unable to, push through many of his most interesting policies. I would like to say, though, a word about foreign policy, and I expect it will be controversial. He has restored various alliances as we expected him to do, and that's all very good. He is understandably at this very moment rather missing in action. And I completely understand that he's between a rock and a hard place on the Israel-Palestine question. But we are in a very dramatic moment, and I say this as someone who is not simply Jewish, but I am also a citizen of Israel. I lived there for 5 years, and I am appalled at the one-sided statements that have been coming out of the White House, calling on Hamas to ceasefire, which is, of course, absolutely correct, but not making any remarks about the fact that Israeli policemen stormed the third holiest space of Islam on the very holiest day in the Muslim calendar. An incredible provocation. And I completely understand that President Biden must feel there are no good choices in this moment. But if the United States wants to lead again in foreign policy, it is seriously up to him. And I've been listening to news from all channels since yesterday. People are waiting for American leadership in this question of preventing a major war and promoting a just peace in Israel-Palestine. So that's my weak hope, because I know how politically difficult it would be for him to lead on this question.
Okay. Jackson James, would you take up next, please?
Well, I think that Susan covered the ground that I was going to address as well. So let me just say that one of the things that I'm concerned about at this point is, as she indicated today, there's a development on the Hill that points to a somewhat fractured Republican Party. But I think that the split in the country is becoming deeper. And that becomes a real problem, it seems to me, for coming to grips with really common problems that we face over the next decade, I would say. So I'm going to use the number of not 100 days, but 545 days. Because that's the, as Susan indicated, that is the time between now and the next congressional elections in 2002, in November 2022. And I'm thinking that between now and then, Biden has to have achieved a certain level of acceptance, or I wouldn't say popularity, but trust in terms of the way that he's trying to change, as he says himself, the paradigm of understanding what it is that the United States government is capable and should be doing to eliminate or to meet the challenges that we face, whether it's the pandemic or whether it's the economic inequities in the country. The question is, will he now, in the next year or year and a half, be able to complete a round of decisions that will allow the country to recover from this enormously difficult challenge of the pandemic, but also to regain a sense of trust in institutions? And that, I think, has been damaged over the last several years. And so, in a way, 100 days is really kind of a very short ticket to measure whether he's going to be able to do that or not. His popularity level at the moment, by the way, Tom, is not 53%, it's 63% as of yesterday.
Oh, okay.
And the question is really whether he can sustain that, given the kind of split, particularly in the Senate, 50-50 split there, and how he can get things done between now and domestically. Now, let me relate that quickly to the foreign policy challenges, which Susan has already pointed out. There's a lot of them well beyond the Middle East. There's certainly China and Russia, and dealing with Iran is its own kettle of fish. And I suspect that what one has to remember in Germany in particular is the fact that one of the campaign slogans that was around the Biden campaign was something called building a foreign policy for the middle class. And in other words, what that meant was making somehow understandable why it is that the United States is engaged on the world stage, but that it's in the interest of the United States to do so, as opposed to a policy which would call for more withdrawal from certain areas and not necessarily being as engaged because of the fact that some of the organizations that we were engaged in were not necessarily in America's interest. I think that is something that he's trying to change. But another test of the next 545 days will be whether or not he can show that the foreign policy re-engagement that he's initiated, and that includes, by the way, Germany, in the sense that he put a stop to the withdrawal of US troops, and I think has now had a more positive attitude toward NATO and the EU in general. Some hot spots like Nord Stream 2 are still in there, unresolved. But I suspect that that is something else. That's the second challenge that it'd be facing, not only on the domestic front, but on the foreign policy front, to show that partnership in leadership is a good thing, as George Herbert Walker Bush once said in 1989. And I think that is something that's also going to test whether or not he can get that message across by November of 22. Because if he doesn't, and there is a reassembling of Republican majorities in both the Senate and the House, which is not an unlikely possibility, he would be facing a situation like Obama did in 2010, with a blockage or a gridlock, let's put it that way. And then I think the question is what that would then pose as a scenario for the election campaign in 2024. So I'm jumping ahead, I know, but this isn't just about 100 days. This is a lot more time involved to think about, which has ramifications not only for the United States, but I also think, by the way, for the Federal Republic of Germany, which is about to elect a new government.
Thank you, Jack. JD, can you sing for your supper now?
Sure, I'd be delighted to, absolutely. And the two previous speakers have focused a lot on domestic politics, and I would agree with them. And the most important thing that came out of the election in last year was Georgia, with 2 senators that made it possible to do anything in the Senate. And I must say, if one had little expectations of Biden, with those 2 new senators and the vice president's tie-breaking decision, you have actually created the possibility for some real successes. And I don't want to overdo it, but when Biden set out his interim security strategy, he had 3 things: America's back, diplomacy is back, and alliances are back. So you can that's kind of the measurement against whether he's successful or not. And I would look. Sure, America is back, and we talked a lot already about the rescue plan and the infrastructure bills. If he does that, he will address the most important policy that Biden needed to address with Trump. That is to say, the people in the United States who had lost their jobs to globalization and trade agreements and the financial crisis. If he can actually prove what Susan just said, that is, the government is actually part of the solution and is not, as Reagan said, the problem, then he will have moved that whole debate back into a different direction. Maybe it's not as progressive as some would like, but it is certainly reversing what has been there. The question I would have is how do you measure whether he's successful or not? And you can look at the Pew poll that has just come out. And talk about diplomacy. Yes, he went back to the Paris Climate Agreement. He went back to the WHO, contributed to COVAX to put the United States in the leading position. 67% of Americans agreed with the WHO leadership issue. 70% of Americans agreed with the climate decision. And if you look to NATO, as Jack has just said, the reinforcement of NATO, and not only that, but also adding another 500 American soldiers at Wiesbaden, 71% of Americans supported NATO. The question then would be coming to the one thing that Jack also mentioned, which is the foreign policy for the middle class. And you have to ask yourself, what does that mean? And it is the one critical point that I've heard a lot of. Does this mean buy American only? Does this mean the America First of the Trump policies? Because he was really talking about working with WTO to hold to the rules of WTO and to reform WTO, but not going back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I would agree should. But he has put conditions down on that, on labor issues and environmental issues and other things to protect American jobs before going into any kind of trade agreements. And this is a similar kind of response. This is a response to that same anger that Americans have felt, and with the idea that unemployment is still very high, that people are still dislocated, the pandemic is not over. So on the positive side, I would say, if you want to, I'll go to the US argument. Is there a bipartisan approach? He's obviously not going to find that in Congress, and he's tried to redefine bipartisanship in the public. And you have very strong majorities for these issues that I just outlined and many others. That really shows that the American people do want the government to take an active role in trying to address the issues that are of concern. Now, that doesn't say all's good. Immigration is a disaster. It's been a long disaster along the way. So you can see that the border issues and the debate that has come out of there. Interesting to see what his response was. His response was to reach out to Presidents Clinton and Bush W, to say they too had immigration policies and we need to address that. That's a problem that's not going to go well for him. It'll be difficult. And he's also assigned Vice President Harris that portfolio. He's a very smart man that way. Russian relations are terrible shape. Not only the sanctions for Navalny and the sanctions on Nord Stream 2, but most recently the Colonial Pipeline ransom attack, cyber attack, running from criminals maybe, but still coming out of Russia, has made it very, very difficult. Puts this in really very difficult times for the transatlantic relationship, because Germany needs to take the initiative. Merkel is clear that Nord Stream 2 is a commercial project. And the argument in Germany is about American sanctions, not about Russian malign behavior. So there's a real problem that has not been resolved. He's given a couple of overtures to the government here to do something, and they've been ignored. And that's not going over well in the United States. And you can then, if there's a bipartisanship, if there is bipartisanship in the United States Congress at all, and in the American people, it's on the relationship with Russia, with like 60+% of Democrats and 80+% of Republicans opposed or not liking or not wanting to deal with the Russians, or with Putin anyway. Then of course, China is a gorilla in the room, and you can see a way that he's operated on both Putin and on Xi Jinping. It's very clear. The United States has interests. We'll defend those interests, and with the China, with the Uyghurs, with Hong Kong, with human rights issues that Xi Jinping does not like. On the other hand, the ability to then reach out to them, he's reached out to Putin, both in signing an extension to New START and also for a meeting. And then with China, it's I find it it's interesting if you think about it in policy terms, that in Germany we have the debate here that China has become is a three-sided relationship. That is, one, a trading partner; two, a economic competitor; and three, a systemic rival. Well, if you listen to what Biden and Tony Blinken are saying, there's a triad on the other side too. That is a cooperator, a competitor, and a rival. There's a possibility for aligning interests, but as we've seen with the comprehensive agreement on investment, you can see that there is not an outreach to align those interests. So there's some problems in the relationship, and patents, you could add to that. That discussion about patents for the pandemic unleashed a debate which should not have happened, in my view. But he speaks in clear terms. Putin, in response to Stephanopoulos' question, a killer. Xi Jinping, yes, we will raise human rights interests. So it's a very balanced thing, but I would say his success will really legislatively depended on those two senators in Georgia and what will happen on the midterm election in 2022. And if I could say something about Palestine and Israel right now, I agree with you, Susan. It's horrible. There was not a good reaction. And it seems to me, maybe not right, or maybe is right, But the actor who's taking the lead in dealing with the Palestinians is Egypt. And that's really strange for the United States to see that. But since the United States is not playing that role, it will be interesting to see if Israel can work with Egypt to deal with the de-escalation.
Okay. JD, thank you very much. Rolf, have you a couple of minutes to add?
Absolutely. First of all, JD, thank you and all the others for your presentation. You have such a global view. It's remarkable. I approaching more through the German point of view. Me looking over to the United States, it's remarkable. I had the fear that in the beginning, Biden would maybe, follow up what his party would like to have him to do, but he resisted to put people from the so-called progressive part of the party into his administration, and he didn't do that. He nominated highly reputed people like Blinken, like Yellen, and I think that was a quick win. And this was this is remarkable, I think. So he did, and also the COVID rescue plan, that was also a quick win. I think this is very popular. So I think also, like Jackson said, the first 100 days are a bit early to judge. I think he's doing pretty fast actually, and pretty good. He's well performing, but the big questions are going to be, going to see in the future. I mean, when we have the other half of the country talking about education, talking about rights of of minorities, talking about other key issues. And then I believe in his inauguration speech, Biden talked a lot about he wants to overcome the split of society. And he wants to reach out his hand, at least to moderate Republicans. He didn't say moderate Republicans, but that's what he meant. Now, if he wants to do that, he needs a message to those 74 million Trump voters. And it will be very interesting to see where he will reach out to these people and where he even would continue Trump's policy, or at least the policy of the Trump administration. We were talking about immigration, we were talking about China, we were talking about Russia. And, he is pretty tough on Russia. JD mentioned the relationship currently is in a horrible condition. But think of it. He called Putin a murderer. If Trump would have said that, everybody would go, oh, typical Trump. But Biden said it. He is tough on China, on trade. He keeps up the tariffs. He seems to be pretty tough also on immigration. And we also have to, in this situation, we have to carefully, there's a distinction between legal immigration, illegal immigration. And all these, topics are going to be handled in the future in the next 100, 200 days. I wouldn't go so far to say the next 540 days, but within the next 100 or 200 days, whether he's able to accomplish, to overcome the split of society, and we will carefully watch and listen. Thank you.
I say a few words to that.
Yes.
So you are right to point out, Russ, that he did not appoint, people who have made the news as progressive Democrats, and who I perhaps would have liked to see in office, although, we need Elizabeth Warren in the Senate and so on and so on. Some of it was political calculation. But the most interesting thing is he has actually put forward more progressive policies. Pardon?
Yep.
More progressive policies than any American president since Franklin Roosevelt. And I want to mention two that I left out. First of all, he's the first president in a very long time to emphasize the importance of unions and the fact that workers' rights have been vastly, the few rights that there actually were in the United States, have been progressively eaten away at with the decline of union membership. And that's terribly important. And the second is his commitment to ending child poverty in the United States, which is higher than a German who hasn't been in certain parts of the United States could possibly believe. I find myself always having to tell Germans, guess what? It's not just that we don't have universal health care, we have no sick leave, including in a pandemic, you know? So the fact that he's addressing those kinds of questions, which really impact far more Trump voters' lives than China or Russia. You know, those are flags that people wave occasionally, but his strategy is clearly to show that progressive policies help exactly the lives of many of the people who voted for Donald Trump. And that seems to me to be the most important, and indeed the only way that he can go, given that it's not quite half of the country, thank the Lord, but given that a large percentage of the country is still living in a universe of alternative facts. So what he's doing is trying to put facts on the ground that are quite, in fact, quite progressive.
Okay, with regard to your comment on Hobson's choice for Israel and Palestine, we have one fellow on this conversation who wrote a preface to a book about a German general who was in the same situation in Paris. And the comment, I read the book and I saw a movie on it, and this German general commented, well, I'm damned if I do. You know, Hitler wanted me to do this and call for all these reparations. And if I do that, there will be mass insurrection here. And no matter what I do is bad. And I suspect that's what President Biden is looking at as well. Could that be, Susan?
Yes, I assume so. And it's also a moment to tell a German audience, because this is one of those facts that you can repeat as often as possible, but they don't stick because they seem so incredible for Europeans. The forces in the United States that push a very strong support of the occupation and Netanyahu's government are by no means only conservative Jews. First of all, the Jewish population in the United States runs to about 2% of the country, and 77% of those are against the occupation and in favor of a two-state solution. The people who are most passionately behind United States support of the Israeli occupation are Christian evangelicals, of which there are about 40 million in the country. They're extremely well organized politically, and you know, they almost all vote for Trump. The oddest thing for Jews like me is that they don't actually want to support Jews. They believe that one needs to increase the Jewish settler population in the West Bank in order to bring on the apocalypse that's prophesied in the Bible, after which Jesus will come again, and the Jews who have not converted will go straight to hell. I understand that you don't want to believe that US foreign policy could be dictated by such an abstruse set of beliefs. But I have done the research, other people have done the research, it is true. So for Biden to push harder on Netanyahu's government would desperately, you know, enrage exactly the Republicans who he would like to calm down at the moment. So it is a situation in which I don't see a good choice, but it is indeed a situation on which the United States should show moral leadership.
Okay,
Can I comment on that?
of course.
As the former ambassador for Holocaust issues for the United States government and is long-term in Germany, as you heard, it seems to me that we're at a point where it is important and it's critical for Germany to take some initiative on some policies. This is particularly one that they should, because as you just heard from Susan, this is not a Jewish question in the United States. It's a much broader question, and it needs the United States. Biden needs the support of Germany to take an initiative in this regard. And it is certainly, since Germany has decided that Israel is part of their foreign policy and is an existential question for Germany, it makes sense. And that transatlantic connection you could use in other issues as well, but this is particularly one where Germany could take a stand with the United States, not just the foreign minister saying, "Go, let's de-escalate." That's not powerful enough. But if it is with the United States, it can have a real effect on the policy and give Biden's policymakers some backing for taking the decisions that they need to take.
Thank you so much, JD. May I quote you on that?
Of course, of course. And you can use the title. I was the first ambassador for Holocaust issues with Stu Eisenstadt when he was Treasury Deputy Secretary. We negotiated the Holocaust, the forced and slave labor issues with Otto Graf Lambsdorff, and we know this is Germany's role is very important in this.
Thank you.
JD, who followed you? Was Ed O'Donnell the
Yeah,
next?
Ed O'Donnell was one of my successors.
Okay.
A couple times.
All right.
Yeah, exactly.
Can we go into some questions if there are no more rebuttals? I wrote a short one on the economic stimulus. As we know, President Biden put forth what he called the Economic Rescue Plan Act of 2021 to stimulate the economy and to provide selected citizens with such benefits such as a $1,400 payment to slake some of the ills of the COVID-19 debacle. This is part of a $1.9 trillion package, of which much is allocated for housing, unemployment, food, and childcare. Almost universally, the Republican Party has opposed this plan as much too big, which is generally the stance of the Republican Party. Recently, responding to some of this largesse, I've noted that some Republican states have gone so far as to restrict their unemployment benefits to counteract the largesse of this economic rescue plan under the guise that, well, we're paying unemployed too much not to work, so why would they work? But this is perhaps a false belief that the stimulus package fosters those who could work from not working. The evidence seems to point to the other direction. Now, we know $1.9 trillion is not a paltry sum. So the questions are, is this really a good package to have put forth? From where might come these monies? Will higher taxes result? And what will be the effect of that? What about inflation? And then the corollary is, as Jack James said, there's 350 days remaining, until the next election. Should President Biden really go for broke and try and get everybody in a really good shape ahead of the 2022 election? And Rolf, can I ask you for your comments on that one first?
Yeah.
Talking about deficit spending and the package?
Yes.
Well, the point there is a saying where like in the past at least, the Democrats are good for the programs and the packages, and the Republicans are good to keep an eye on the budget and the deficit spending. I mean, there was a columnist in these days from the Bild who wrote remarkably in his glossary that the current administration is entering a restaurant and then inviting everybody for free beer, but it's not paying the bill. And the same seems to happen. So I think the pandemic currently maybe, justifies such actions. But I think within the next 1 or 2 years, in my belief, I think we should be very, very careful where we spend money. And there are other programs like I mentioned education. I meant the infrastructure program, and they're more mid and long term. What we currently see are short-term incentives to the economy, but I believe that we need more a stimulus which lasts a little longer, and we in the U.S. should be enabled to have enough reserves to spend on further actions. So this is also where I think has to stop, and where he has to keep an eye on the budget.
Okay. Susan, have you a comment?
Yeah, I do. Ralph, I'm afraid you're forgetting the last administration. One might have said that the Republicans are good for keeping an eye on the budget, except when it comes to large tax cuts for people who don't need them. Then they make no protest. But enough Americans remember just how much Trump's tax cuts added to the deficit, that they are quite in favor. There's majority, I don't know what the last number is, are in favor of higher taxes on the extraordinary wealth gap that has developed over the past years and increased, of course, during the pandemic by leaps and bounds. Frankly, I find it obscene that people who are, making large salaries and have large savings complain about or would like to cut the $300. I mean, do you know what groceries cost in the United States? Not to mention healthcare. I'm talking about people who are having trouble with basic needs. And the Republicans, certainly since Ronald Reagan, have not paid attention to those needs under an ideology that, trickle-down economics will work for everybody. It doesn't. And I think the majority of Americans have understood that.
Well, talking about taxation.
Ralph, you hung up here. There we go.
Beg your pardon? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm
You
talking about
hung up, but
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay. Talking about taxation. The Trump administration gives us a bit. The Biden administration gives us a bit different picture. On one hand, you're trying to support corporates. On the other hand, you're trying to tax them higher. Now, don't forget, the tax cuts from the Trump administration were due to the fact that we have a tax competition worldwide, and the US had a pretty high corporate taxes, and it only went more or less to the OECD level. So that was not just as you mentioned it, a gift or a donation to the super rich. It was also a reaction of worldwide tax system competition. Now, the Biden administration wants to step back. Now, they want to raise again corporate taxation, but on the other hand, they're subsidizing or at least supporting corporates. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, it'd be very interesting to see how this the Biden administration will achieve a
Okay, you may have a slightly perverted connection there, Ralph. You hung up
I'm
again.
sorry.
And well, it's not your fault.
All right.
Sentence, but I think we
Sorry.
have the gist of your thing. Jack, do you have anything to add?
I mean, I think it's pretty clear that this is a balancing act. I mean, the fact of the matter is that the deficit has been going up for decades. And, the concept of, people getting into government and then saying, well, the deficit doesn't matter. I think actually Lynn Cheney's father said that back in the beginning of this millennium. But then again, when they're out of power, everybody concentrates on the deficit. I mean, the deficit went up 36%, in the Trump years. So, we got a kind of everybody's, responsible for that in the longer run. I think that the issue now is going to be whether or not, again, this question mark of how much the country at large, I want to put that again out there, feels comfortable and quite frankly, confident about the ability of the government to help solve problems while we still are allowing economic growth to occur. That's a balancing act that's been going on for a long time. But under these circumstances that we are in economically and in the pandemic situation as well, there are situations like there were back in the 1930s. Tom, you mentioned that at the top of the hour, where some initiatives have to be taken to make sure that this doesn't get any worse. This misappropriation of resources for the entire country. So again, I'm going to come back to, isn't 300 days, Tom? It's 545 days ahead. And I think these next months will be an extremely difficult test for the United States to understand itself as to what is at stake, not in the context of elections every 2 years, but for the next decades and for the children that we are all trying to raise here, to give them a chance to have an opportunity to thrive in an economy that at the moment is hamstrung. And I think under these circumstances, the comparison with the Roosevelt period is not far off. The solutions may be different, but the gravity is the same.
Tom, may I just make a short intervention on the financial side? There is a real concern when you pump $4 trillion into the American economy, you're going to have inflationary pressures. But at the same time, you have taxes raised for those making more than $400,000 a year. And the U.S. economy is 70% based on consumer spending, unlike Germany, which is around, 50%. That is to say that spending will come back into taxes as well. So you have a different philosophy than the trickle down philosophy. You actually have empowering people to spend and buy and support the economy, but at the same time increasing taxes on the over $400,000 a year earners. Inflation may or may not, at least if you believe Larry Summers, yes, it's a terrible thing. On the other hand, there are plenty of other economists and financial experts who say, no, if this mix is different, then that would cause a rapid increase in inflation. And we watch, as Ralph talked about, we have Yellen out there watching very carefully. And the Fed has two responsibilities. It's not just monetary, it's also unemployment in the United States, a dual portfolio.
Okay, if I may change the subject title, let's go to law enforcement, civil strife, such things as Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and so on. We all know that a week or so ago, the state of Minnesota convicted one of its police officers for multiple counts of murder, manslaughter, etc., of a Black Minnesota resident. This is an amazing departure from the normal course of events in America, where the police seem to remain immune from charges and certainly convictions for acts allegedly committed in the pursuit of their duties. Subsequently, after this conviction, the U.S. government indicted the same individual and 3 others on federal charges related to the same event. Some would say this signals a very significant change towards the police. And I would comment that President Biden himself personally telephoned the family of George Floyd to wish them well and comment on the outcome. Now, the incident that led up to this resulted in multiple large demonstrations by the lives of Black Lives Matter. These were, as best I can tell, generally peaceful. But the Trump administration insinuated these demonstrations were anything but and were the result of terrorist activities. Rumor has it that if you study any of the violence in Minneapolis in this regard, it was because of some extreme right-wing agitators, the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, etc., who were even masquerading as the Black Lives Matter type of thing. Now, is Biden doing enough to lessen this very wide chasm in our society? That is law enforcement if you're Black or not white. What else can he do to promote a more racially equal society? Should there be a general rethinking of our national attitude towards the police and how they react? There are movements entitled Defund the Police that cause emotional reactions as well. And realizing that every one of us wants some form of law and order if it is equally administered. What can we do in this regard and keep the pendulum, which is now swung very far in one direction, from overreacting and going back equally in the other direction? And I think Susan Nyman is probably by far the most competent to field the first question here.
There's several things that I think we can do. I think white people need to make it clear to ourselves just how pervasive violence towards people of color is, and how even if people aren't actually killed by the cops, it dominates their lives. One of the things people talk about white privilege, sometimes, I'm not happy about all of the ways that discussion goes, but the strongest form of white privilege really came home to me when Black parents started talking about giving their children the talk and when they gave it to them. And I realized I've raised 3 children. Everybody knows you have all kinds of fears for your children. They could get hit by a drunk driver, anything could happen to them. But I never had to sit a child of mine down and say, this is how you behave if you're stopped by the police, otherwise he could kill you. So I think, first of all, all of us need to realize just how rampant it is and how the numbers keep going up. I'm sure it's gone up since the last time I looked. The numbers of people, Black people who have been killed by police since George Floyd was murdered it was over 200 the last time I looked. So that's, despite the awareness. The most moving letter, I got a number of fan letters after my book, Learning from the Germans, came out. Got some hate mail too, but not too much. Was the most moving one was from the former police chief, a white man, of a large southern town. I won't identify him any further. And he wrote to thank me for my book and to say he wished he'd read it before he retired. He would have been a better public servant. And I wrote back to thank him and said, but surely you can now have influence over younger officers and more influence than I could. And then he began to tell me a number of things that shocked me to the core. He said in his state, the number of hours that a police officer needs to train before they're allowed to go on the force with a gun and enforce the law on the street is less than the number of hours you need in order to cut hair, okay? That is, there is no unified standard of training. Let's just, defund the police, as President Obama said, was the stupidest slogan that anybody ever came up with. Let's talk about training police and focus on facts like those. There is no national standard for teaching police officers how to defuse situations, how to recognize mental illness, what to do with them, and that combined with what is a long-standing picture of Black men in particular as predators is responsible for this terrible epidemic of violence.
JD, you're always the true diplomat.
I would endorse that, and I would say that it's not simply a question of legislation. There is some legislation that's happening now, and I think that's important. But there are some compromises being made to change the way that the police are protected or not protected for some of the things they've done. But it's really a civic issue. And if you allow, I would go back to the question of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum teaching, and I taught there as well for policemen, for firemen, for diplomats, about how you treat other people. And put it in that context, it's very powerful. And you get policemen and others who walk away and say, oh, I understand now what happens when we don't treat people equally and don't treat them with respect and don't treat them with the human respect that is necessary. So I would say it's not just simply a question for the politicians to talk about. I think it's really a question for civil society to reach out. And it doesn't have to be in the context of what we did in Washington at the Holocaust Memorial Museum, but there are lots of places where you can do that kind of teaching. The churches can play a very important role. Schools can play a very important role. There are lots of curricula out there for universities as well. So I think it's a larger issue that if the politicians want to do something that really addresses the issue, that's what they should be asking. They should be asking Americans to get out and do these things that only they can do. And again, if I must say, Germany has a very important role to just explain that. And the Goethe Institutes in the United States play a very important role in explaining what happens when you don't treat people well. It doesn't have to be only of the Holocaust, but has to do what we have here in Germany now with Muslims, with immigrants. And that's the kind of thing that could bring the two countries together in a very important way.
Jack or Rolf, any additional comments?
I'm fine, no.
Okay.
I would simply add one fact, and that is I think I'm right about this. There are 18,000 police departments in the United States. And if you put that together with Susan's comment about how people are, asymmetrically trained to carry out the responsibilities of policing in their communities, it must be a very divergent picture. And how you deal with that has to do with what JD said about civic education at the level of most Americans, and not dictated, necessarily from Washington. But the point being is that this is a ground up discussion that has to have roots in our communities. And in some ways, that's the only, I think, the best way to achieve not only improvement, but real change in attitudes. We've been through this before in the 60s with regard to the civil rights movement. And I think it has to happen again in terms of trying to get people to take on their own responsibilities where they are and to hold standards higher than they perhaps are in various different parts of the country.
Okay. A bit of administration. I've got 6 more questions, and the answers are much longer than I had bargained on. I can ask 1 or 2, and we'll be well over our allotted time, or we can go on until 6 o'clock tonight. The option belongs to the rest of you, and just let me know via chat or something. a question I find very important, and one I just cannot comprehend. I just can't comprehend how we can be engulfed in this, is what's referred to as the big lie. And a significant percentage of the US population, amazingly to me, continues to question the results of the November 2020 presidential election, even though nowhere can there be found credible evidence of any significant voter fraud. That's domestic, that includes Russia and all of their dirty tricks. It's end of sentence. This line of reasoning started early in the presidential campaign when Donald Trump, among other declarations, stated, "The only way I could lose to sleepy Joe Biden is if the election is rigged." And from that point on, that comment seems to hold. We know there were 60 or 61 lawsuits filed on this matter, every one of which was dismissed without cause. Apparently, Rudy Giuliani and his troops were telling the population one thing, but had to own up to true facts for the courts. The US Supreme Court managed to not accept hearing these, even with 3 Trump appointees, and this lie continues. As part of that, we saw the shenanigans on the 6th of January, where the entire election was going to be called into question, and the vice president upheld his duty, luckily. But to shorten this question, what can we do or what can President Biden do to reduce this errant belief, if anything? Has he done enough to date? Is there even a resolution to this dichotomy in thinking and reasoning? And does the world have to live by Vladimir Lenin's famous comment that a lie told often enough becomes the truth? And
Sorry, that was Goebbels who said that. So
well, it could have. That I didn't know. Everything I said, everything I read attributes it to Lenin, but Goebbels is fine too.
guess we read different books. I mean, I'll just take it.
I'm a country boy from Texas, so what, I defer to everybody else.
I'm a kid from Georgia too, originally. So, hey, look, let me just say very briefly, people expect philosophers to be able to answer the question, what do we do about truth with people who believe in alternative facts? And I don't have a better answer to that than anybody else does. I think Biden is really doing the only thing that he can, which is, rather than trying to argue with such people, is to actually try to put policies and programs in place that will help the people who Trump appealed to, but did very, very little to help, and hope that that will turn the tide. I don't see any direct way of reasoning or arguing with people who reject reason and evidence.
That's what you were saying, Ralph, I think, wasn't it? Addressing the 74 million.
Yes, absolutely.
Does it work?
We'll see. For me, as a German, I just want to point out something else, which is legal, but a bit strange. I'm in Germany. I'm a so-called, I support the elections. We count, like, physically the votes, all right? Now, if there's a vote coming in after, and the election is closed after 6 p.m. on the Sunday afternoon, the story's over. Now in the States, we have different state rules and state laws. Now in one state, I had a difficult time to explain my German friends that in one state, you need the stamp from the current day, if you have a proxy. Now, if you have, if you vote by mail, like in a different state, the letter, the vote has to be there on the same day. Now you have different. This is not this is not a manipulation. Don't get me wrong. I just from my understanding as a German, how can it be that a large nation has different ruling on the same election in different states, right? So that's a bit difficult from an international point of view to understand. But I think the US is mature enough at one point to have a one law, every vote counts the same, and there is the same deadline for each voter in the United States. That would definitely help.
Well, you have these two bills, the House one and the Senate one. If they pass, the Constitution sets out that the states, the individual the states of the United States would make their own rules for the elections. But you're right, you could have this bill pass with some basic criteria for equal time and voting rights. So we'll see if they get rid of the filibuster. Maybe.
Get rid of the filibuster.
I think you guys are getting into the weeds of discussion about the institutional changes. Let me just remind you all, I think that we are in a lot more trouble than we think.
Okay.
I'm too young to remember or too old to remember, whatever the case may be, too young at that point to actually have followed the McCarthy period in the 50s. But I do remember people talking about the fact that that scar was going to stay with us. And if you look at that point when in 1957 or 58 or whenever it would happen, that one guy in a CBS network, Edward R. Murrow, took McCarthy to task and basically destroyed his credibility with one broadcast. The notion that today our media system is so pervasively filled with the kind of things that nurture people's senses of grievance, of alternative realities, if you want. I don't know how you put that toothpaste back in the tube. And so as a result, I think that what's going to have to happen is that it's not going to necessarily be we're all going to have a kumbaya experience over the next years. We're just going to have to fight tooth and nail over what it is that we think is important at the federal and the state level. And I'm not entirely sure how that's going to wind up getting us out of the current situation, which is almost metaphorically captured by the fact that the Senate is 50-50. Yesterday's vote on that law, that proposed law that JD just mentioned in a subcommittee of the Senate went down completely down party lines. And so we are stuck at the moment, in a moment of time when we don't really have the ability to deal with the kind of media presence that has basically become a possibility for people to put themselves in their own igloo, their own mental igloo. And how we get out of that is going to be the basic challenge for any president or any leader at any level over the next, I would say, decade or possibly two. So we're in deeper trouble than I think we sometimes want to tell ourselves.
Just a moment. Susan, my notes show you have another engagement. So if you need to depart, please do so with my thanks, the thanks of the American German Business Club, of the 50 people here participating. We really appreciate your insight and your comments, and I stand corrected on who I attributed quotations to.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed meeting all the other speakers very much, and I hope we will be in touch again in the real world.
Well, some of us are in Berlin periodically. We're here in Frankfurt and some in Munich. So if you ever travel anywhere in that area, we hope you will let us know. And one favor from my end, I have your book, What Can We Learn from the Germans? Is it appropriate if I send that to you and you sign your name to it and return it?
Happy to do so.
Okay. Again, thank you ever so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you all.
Okay, we were still on the big lie. Rolf, do you have much more to comment? Or
No,
JD?
no, I've made my comments and that.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
I have questions on immigration, and I think here we have, I think JD is somewhat of an expert on it, but this, as we know, is a very divisive issue in the American population. And Rolf earlier commented that there are two forms, legal and illegal, but immigration in both forms has been difficult since almost the founding of the United States, even though I and almost every other American are the product of immigrants. My parents came from Europe, and now I'm back. Stranger things have happened. The Trump administration policy was to decrease the ability of anyone to immigrate to the United States. They set a limit of 16,500 legal immigrants for year 2000, and that's down from several hundred thousand annually during, I believe, the Obama administration. As part of its policy to discourage immigration, the Trump administration even went so far as to separate children from their parents and hope that would be a sufficient deterrent. Now, apparently life in Central America or wherever is so bad in some people's mind that even that was not deterrent enough. Biden seems to have been a bit wishy-washy in this, for lack of a better term. At one time, he appeared to support the 16,000. He started out with 60 some odd thousand, reduced that to 16,500, and then in the wake of a big backlash, we're now back at in the 60,000 immigrant per year range. The Republicans, especially in Texas, Arizona, and California, keep sending photographs and editorials, articles on how terrible the conditions are, and they blame all of this on President Biden, even though it was the same under President Trump, as best I can tell. And my question is President Biden following a proper course for resolving this never-ending issue? Is his handling of the unaccompanied separated children correct? He did send some from Texas to California for proper care and is doing his best to reunite them, but is that the correct form? And what is the resolution, if any, between legal versus illegal immigration?
Well, let me try to make a few comments on immigration. Immigration, as we know here in Europe, is also a very difficult question to answer. And if you have to go to what I do for a living, that is dealing with conflict resolution, that's one of the things that you should be looking at. And what has happened in Central America in particular was addressed earlier in earlier administrations and then reversed by the Trump administration. That is to fund ways to help deal with the crime problems, with the development problems and issues in Central America. And the same can be said also for the NAFTA agreement when it was written. The idea was to increase the prosperity in Mexico and ease the flight of economic refugees. Those are the policy things that certainly can be done. It's too early, I think, for Biden to have addressed this in a comprehensive way. As I said, he did reach out to Presidents Clinton and Bush to try to reintroduce the legislation, to answer the last question you had about legal status of people. The culture in the Immigration and Customs Enforcement ICE organization is very racist and very anti-immigrant. That's a very cultural problem there. The resources necessary to deal with these refugees and migrants is too little, and there is no comprehensive process. And so I can understand why the president asked Vice President Harris to take on that portfolio, because it's very, very difficult, and it's very time consuming, and it's wrought with all kinds of issues. I think if he has a chance, that is to say, if he has 4 years instead of 1.5, that process will probably have some effect, because you also need migrants for economic reasons as well, for migrant workers that come, but also for the next generation of workers, whether they are in manufacturing or services. And remember, the two big companies in Silicon Valley are not done by Americans. They're done by Americans who are immigrants. And they, you know, when you think about Russian immigrants and others who have come to the United States, that's a very important part of the innovation and the economic prosperity of the United States. So it's a very complicated issue. I don't think Biden has begun even to address all the complicated issues. And the media, as Jack has noted, the media is very counterproductive in trying to come to a debate on this issue. It is much more partisan and much more divisive than it need be.
Okay. Jack, do you have any comments? I know we need to bring this to a close. All of us have, or a good number of us have appointments coming up soon. So I will try and end this with this question then, if we get agreement.
Go ahead with that question. I mean, I think that basically JD put it all into perspective. And my sense is that, you know, over the next period of time, I'm not sure whether or not we're talking about 2 years, 4 years, or even more longer, but I think that younger generations in the United States may have a very, very different attitude toward dealing with the increasing heterogeneity of the society. And I think that's to some extent also a comparative development in Germany, where you have a increasing heterogeneity of German society. And I think those are two developments that will test the inclusiveness of the way we think about our society in the future. And that will be not only a question of people in Washington, D.C. speaking from the White House, but will be right down to the community efforts to come to grips with those kinds of challenges and those kinds of questions. How much variance, how much heterogeneity in our society can we tolerate, and how much heterogeneity do we need? And it's been in this country a kind of a foundation of faith that heterogeneity, immigration, and other things have been the positive notion of this country. And I think that's something that we have to kind of get a hold of again and understand the answer to those two questions.
Okay.
May I add something?
Quickly.
Okay, quickly. Jackson, you're too bright and you're too academical for me. Because I believe the question currently is, and also JD mentioned out the economical need for immigration. Now that is not the point. The solution we need is what kind of immigration we need, and this has not been solved at the southern border. All right. So we're talking about the illegal immigration. I think the legal immigration can be solved really, I think, easily according to a application list, more or less. But illegal immigration is the topic of these days, and I don't think if there's an answer how many foreigners the U.S. society is able to integrate. I think it's or even the economy. It's more question the people who are queuing up are basically are not getting any benefit from this. These people who are just trying basically to get illegal into the country are getting benefiting out of it. I think this is the question of the of current days.
Yeah, I wouldn't disagree with you. I think it is going to be a balance between those two things. But all I'm saying is that in the United States, over 240 years, we've been saying to ourselves, we are a country of immigrants. And so that's part of our dogma. And in Germany, you know, you and I know that Germany had to struggle with that along the lines of the last 30, 40 years. I think that's changing too. So all I want to do is underscore the fact that I think both societies are facing some interesting challenges about, you know, what's German and what's American. And I think that's an important and healthy discussion to have.
Okay, all right.
Can we end this discussion on that note? It's 4:30. It's more than half an hour later than I had anticipated. I know some of us have other things to do. I promise, if you wish, we will have an in-person panel discussion or discussion at a dinner at a nice place like we used to do. There must be a return to normality. I know some of the vaccines made here in Germany are made from Germans who are immigrants as well. And let's hope that that continues. JD, Ambassador Außerdienst Bindenagel, thank you very much for joining with us again. It's always a pleasure. Jack, we always like your sage input. I know you've talked to us several times. We prefer you in person to video. And in absentia to Susan, who added a rather interesting aspect to this discussion. And for those that are interested, she does get good write-ups on her books. Rolf, I'm forever grateful that you substituted with about 30 minutes prior notice. We will send Klaus-Dieter Frankenberger a note wishing him well.
Yes, please.
And with that, thank every one of you for joining with us, and hopefully you'll see fit to do it again.
All right. Thank you for moderating.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers. Bye.
My pleasure. Bye.
Okay, bye.